Lecture 4, Hitler's Assumption of Power.
I'd like to begin this session with really the last days of the Weimar Republic. The aftermath of the elections in November of 1932 left no parliamentary majority in sight. Hindenburg held 2 meetings with Hitler, and in each case refused to grant Hitler what he wanted, refused to grant Hitler emergency decree power, certainly was not going to appoint him as Chancellor at that point. Papen, as Reich Chancellor, now had determined that what he wanted to do was to dissolve the Reichstag, since it was unworkable, and suppress both the communists and the Nazis by using the army and the police. He would work out a new constitution that would be authoritarian in nature, which would be later approved by plebiscite or some sort of national assembly. At any rate, the Weimar Constitution was to go. A new authoritarian government would take its place. His Minister of Defense, who was General Kurt von Schleicher, believed that it would be impossible for the army to handle both the communists and the Nazis. The army simply wasn't up to it. He produced a study by the army to support this view, which suggested that moving against the communists and the Nazis simultaneously simply would not work, that it would hurl the country into civil war, the outcome of which could not be guaranteed. Schleicher also argued that the government should make a greater effort now to forge some sort of workable political alliance with elements of the NSDAP and with the labor unions. Schleicher's fears about a civil war frightened Hindenburg, who reluctantly now passed over Franz von Papen and asked General Schleicher to form a cabinet of his own. Now, a general of the German army has now become Chancellor of Germany, but Hindenburg couldn't bring himself to get completely rid of Franz von Papen. Papen exercised a peculiar sort of charm over Hindenburg. He may have been the only person in life that Papen had this influence over. But Hindenburg asked him to stay on as his private advisor. And this would prove to be quite important. Schleicher now was sworn in as Chancellor on December 2nd, 1932, and the Weimar Republic moved into its last death throes. Schleicher struck out on a new path. He began talks with both the Social Democratic and Christian labor unions in an effort to win support from the moderate left. He revoked a number of Papen's unpopular pro-business emergency decrees. He stepped up public works programs begun by his predecessor, and he sought to convince Gregor Strasser, and other Nazis to cooperate with the new government, holding out the possibility of some sort of official government post. Gregor Strasser was extremely unhappy with Hitler's all-or-nothing strategy, and in December of 1932, Strasser, as second in command of the party, resigned his position. So what the new chancellor is trying to do is to coax Strasser into entering the government and possibly bringing his own followers with him, to split the NSDAP, in other words. Moreover, Schleicher hoped that an improving economy would deflate the radicalism that had plagued the Weimar Republic almost since its inception. All of what I think we would now call the leading economic indicators suggested that the depression in Germany had bottomed out in August of 1932, and that within the foreseeable future things were going to get better. That is, that there was indeed light at the end of the tunnel. So what Schleicher hoped to do was to hang on long enough to benefit from an improving economic situation. He hoped that this improved economy would deflate the National Socialists and that a weakened, more malleable NSDAP could actually be taken into the government to prop up the government, or if the Nazis continued to cause trouble, simply to allow the Nazis to wither away in opposition. But the key here was economic recovery. Schleicher promised to build what he called, quote, an economic system beyond capitalism and socialism, close quote. Whatever that meant, nobody was quite sure what it meant, least of all, I suspect, General Schleicher. His government, however, lacked a constituency. The Social Democrats were highly skeptical about this army general making overtures to the labor unions. And the Nazis did not split. That is, Strasser resigned from the party, but he refused to lead a rebellion against Hitler. He resigned from the NSDAP and went into private life. There was no split within the NSDAP as a result of Schleicher's policy. The moderate bourgeois parties were simply too weak to offer any real support for the government, and so Schleicher found himself in a position that was all too common for the governments of the late Weimar Republic. He lacked a popular constituency. Acting on his own at this point, Franz von Papen met with Hitler in Cologne on the 4th of January 1933 at the home of a prominent banker, Kurt von Schröder. At this meeting, Papen laid out plans for a Papen-Hitler government, or a Hitler-Papen government. It was not clear from these earlier discussions, in which Papen basically said that if Hitler would play ball, that Papen would be able to win Hindenburg's support for Hitler, some sort of Hitler government. When Schleicher discovered this meeting, he went public, condemning it without knowing that Hindenburg had actually encouraged Papen to continue his soundings with the Nazis. What one is beginning to see here is the role of personality, the role of personal intrigue. Historians, I think, in the late 20th century are quite taken with sociological structures, overarching interpretations having to do with the economy within society. But in these last few weeks of the Weimar Republic, personality played an enormously important role with Papen, and particularly with Hindenburg. At the same time, Schleicher's position was simultaneously weakened by complaints from agricultural interests about his flirtation with the labor unions and his agricultural policies. He refused to grant Alfred Hugenberg, the head of the Conservative Party, the Ministry of Economics, which alienated the Conservative Party. And his talks with the labor unions ended without any sort of dramatic conclusion. The Social Democrats remained opposed, convinced that a National Socialist government, even if it came into being, could not possibly last long. It was a very widespread feeling in Germany. One of the best ways of dealing with the National Socialists was to let them into power. That if you finally let the Nazis into power, they'd have to actually make policy. They'd have to make decisions. They wouldn't be able to promise everything to everybody, and that they would be just as incapable as everybody else of dealing with the situation. The Social Democrats and the Communists believed that a National Socialist cabinet would be of very short duration indeed. So they were the Social Democrats were not very keen on helping Schleicher with his difficulties. Moreover, the Communists at this point were following a policy developed in Moscow in which they saw the greatest danger to the working class in Germany coming not from the Nazis, but from the Social Democrats. The strategy of the German Communist Party in this period was to label the Social Democrats as, quote, social fascists, and argue that the most effective way of defending the working class against fascism was to destroy social democracy, to win the workers away from the Social Democrats, and then to be able to confront the fascists. As a consequence, there was very little cooperation between these two extremely important parties on the left, the Communists and the Social Democrats. The Nazis' position was still very weak, but was buoyed momentarily in January, when the party did quite well in a regional election, again in this tiny state of Lippe, a state that was almost tailor-made for Nazi success. The Nazis threw everything they had into this one tiny state to try to make up ground from the November fiasco. And I think the interpretation by virtually everybody of their success in Lippe was this is something that they couldn't repeat, that they had really thrown everything they had into it, and this was not the beginning of an upward trend of Nazi popularity. Nonetheless, 1 week later, negotiations for some sort of Hitler-Papen cabinet resumed, and Hitler was actually won over to the idea. At this point, Schleicher, dismayed by his failures, asked Hindenburg to dissolve the Reichstag, to declare a state of emergency, and to ban both the Nazis and the Communists. Now, if this sounds familiar, it should, because this is exactly the plan that Papen had suggested only a month or so before, a plan which Schleicher himself had said was unworkable because the Army couldn't manage the situation. Now the general finds himself going to Hindenburg with exactly the same sort of plan. Even Hindenburg realized he'd heard this before, and the Army report, which had claimed that this would be impossible, was produced. Hindenburg refused. When rumors that Schleicher was contemplating a coup d'etat were leaked, the bourgeois parties flared in protest, and now Schleicher's position was untenable. Meanwhile, Papen, Hugenberg, and Hitler had decided in principle to form a coalition, but they hadn't reached any sort of agreement about who would hold what position, who would be chancellor, and so on. Hugenberg, the head of the Conservative Party, I realize all these proper names, and especially when you get Hugenberg, Hindenburg, and Hitler, that this begins to sound difficult. Hugenberg, Papen, and Hitler now reach an agreement in principle that they're going to try to form some sort of coalition, that they can go to Hindenburg and say we're going to have the Nazis and the conservatives coming together in some sort of coalition which we think will have a chance of survival. They hadn't reached agreement on the composition of a cabinet and so on. Meanwhile, a general of the German army was recruited to state the case to Hindenburg. If you had to go to the old field marshal, it was best to do it with an army officer. Moreover, pressure from agrarian, industrial, and military sources mounted for some sort of Papen, Hugenberg, Hitler government. And Oskar von Hindenburg, the president's son, also was now involved in this intrigue to provide a new government. Finally, on January 28th, with his position undermined, Schleicher resigned, and Papen was dispatched to conclude final negotiations with Hitler about the formation of a government. Hitler, now that power actually seemed to be within his grasp, became quite specific about what he wanted. He demanded the chancellorship for himself. Until this point, the discussions had revolved around various possibilities, but now Hitler made it clear that if he were going to enter the government and bring the National Socialists with him, he was going to do so from the position of chancellor. Moreover, he didn't demand many positions in the new government. He said he'd be satisfied with three. Three, as we will see, would be quite important. Papen agreed to be vice-chancellor and also Reichskommissar for Prussia. And Hugenberg stated his desire to become the economic czar. He wanted to become Minister of Economics. The negotiations between these three men went back and forth for about 24 hours. And then finally, on the 30th of January, 1933, the three men were taken into the presence of President Hindenburg, who agreed to the formation of a Hitler-Papen government. Hitler was to be chancellor, Papen vice-chancellor, Hugenberg minister of economics and agriculture. The Nazis would have only two other positions in the government. Hermann Goering was made deputy commissar for Prussia, a position that sounds odd until one realizes that what it did was to give him control over the police forces of the largest state in Germany. And Wilhelm Frick was to be made Reich Minister of the Interior. Minister of the Interior in Germany did not mean worrying about snail darters or acid rain. It meant control over the police. So that although the Nazis have only three positions in this new government, they are absolutely important positions. The announcement of Hitler's appointment as chancellor sent a shock wave through Germany. There was a torchlight parade that extended for over a mile past the Reichschancellery, through the Brandenburg Gate and down unto den Linden, in a real sense that something profoundly important had occurred. Nonetheless, if one reads contemporary accounts, and one of the things I would really urge you to do is to go read accounts from the New York Times or go read Time Magazine's accounts of these events in late January, early February, and into March of 1933. I said one of the things that is most difficult about the enterprise we're embarked upon is to forget what you know. Forget what you know the outcome is and concentrate on events at hand. Because the prevailing wisdom about what had happened in Germany was that the Nazis had finally been tricked. That the real power in the government was Alfred Hugenberg, the head of the Conservative Party, and that the Nazis had been, to use one of the terms that floated about at the time, that the Nazis had been sandbagged. They'd been tricked into entering a cabinet in which they were in a distinct minority, and that the Conservatives were now actually going to be able to tame the National Socialists, and Hitler in particular. It would not be the first, it was not the first, nor would it be the last time that Hitler and the National Socialists were drastically underestimated. Still, the Nazis made little effort initially to influence appointments beyond the cabinet. That is, there was no great rush to place National Socialists in key positions in the government, either at the national, state, or local levels. And within a few days, it really did seem, after this sort of initial euphoria among the SA and Nazis around Germany, it really did seem as if the National Socialists had somehow been contained, that there hadn't been a wholesale change of personnel. Certainly conservatives, people to the right of center, found themselves in positions of power, but there had certainly been no purge of the civil service and a replacing of officials with Nazis. Hitler demanded, however, that the Reichstag be dissolved and new elections called. Set for March 5th. Hugenberg and Papen were very uneasy about this. They thought they had Hitler where they wanted him. The Nazis were weakened because of their surprisingly poor showing in November of 1932. The last thing Hugenberg and Papen wanted was another election in which the Nazis now might be able to use Hitler's position as chancellor to strengthen their appeal at the polls. Nonetheless, they felt that they had no choice, and so they acquiesced. Hitler, therefore, dissolved the Reichstag. New elections were set for March 5th. And Germany embarked on yet another electoral campaign. But before the campaign could really get underway, the government used a communist appeal for a general strike on January 31st. The day after Hitler's appointment, the communists had issued a call for a general strike, but had made no moves to actually implement it. The government used this as a pretext to have Hindenburg issue an emergency decree, formally introduced on February 4th, quote, for the protection of the German people. This emergency decree of February 4th permitted a ban on public meetings and a ban on the partisan press if the new government of national concentration was, quote, brought into contempt, close quote. What that meant, in effect, was that opposition to or critical statements about the new government could now be seen as sedition, subversion, and the government could move against the party, the offending party. On February 5th, the day after this emergency decree, a second was introduced which dissolved every elected body in the state of Prussia. Prussia is 3/5 of Germany. The argument used by Papen and by Goering was that the elected officials of the state had to be brought into line with the new national realities. Therefore, those elected bodies were dissolved. They were controlled to a very great extent by Social Democrats. So this is actually a way of getting rid of potential Social Democratic opposition. Moreover, it's important because on February 6th, all power in Prussia was now shifted to the Papen-Goering Prussian authorities. And control of the police was now placed firmly in the hands of the new government. 14 police chiefs in the major cities of Prussia were forced to retire. Some were replaced by National Socialists, most, however, by conservatives. And at this point, a whole group of local and regional officials were forced out of office, mostly Social Democrats or left liberals. They were not always replaced by National Socialists, but people clearly sympathetic to the new German government. The new authorities also, in effect, banned campaign activity by the left for the March 5th elections. The communist newspaper Die Rote Fahne was banned, as well as several social democratic newspapers. The police were now given free rein to conduct searches and seizures in communist and social democratic offices. Communist and social democratic party leaders were now harassed, their homes searched, they were taken down to police headquarters for interrogation, released, but the harassment continued and with a very, very sinister quality to it indeed. The SA, the stormtroopers, which now numbered over 500,000, remember the army is 100,000, in Germany, the stormtroopers were now in effect encouraged to conduct terrorist activities against the left. It was clear that the police were not going to intervene as long as the targets were clearly communists or social democrats. Finally, on February 22nd, Goering, in a public statement, declared that the situation in Germany was perilous, that Germany stood on the brink of a civil war, that the seizures of documents from communist strongholds clearly indicated that the German Communist Party was intending a coup, certainly a revolution, and that the police in Germany simply would not be capable of dealing with this situation. As a consequence, he argued that the police needed reinforcements. The police needed auxiliary support. Where might that auxiliary support come from, one asks. Whole units of the SA were marched down to police headquarters and sworn in now as auxiliary police. The SA units who had been fighting the communists in the streets, fighting pitched battles with the authorities, now appeared in public as arms of the law. On their left arm, they wore the swastika armband, and on the right, a white armband to show that they were now officers of the police. Once this was done, any sort of hope to maintain any authority in Germany other than a National Socialist or at least Hitler-Papen sort of authority was extremely difficult. Hitler, however, was intent on avoiding confrontation within the cabinet. He was happy to let Hugenberg posture as the economic czar. Hugenberg, in early 1932, was coming into cabinet meetings and had all sorts of notions about how to revive the economy and what he wanted to do and setting up offices and so on. Hitler was absolutely an ideal of cooperation here. Whatever you want, Herr Hugenberg. Yes, of course, Herr Hugenberg, since he had absolutely no intention of allowing things to go very far. And he was perfectly happy to have Hugenberg focus his attention on these economic matters while Hitler concentrated on the political situation. Hitler made a great public show of refusing party suggestions to use the treasury to conduct the campaign. Local Nazi officials had pointed out that the party was bankrupt, basically. Didn't really have enough money to conduct an effective campaign, and therefore, why not simply tap the treasury since the party had now come to power? Hitler made a great public show of saying, no, we couldn't allow this. The treasury is that of the state. The National Socialist German Workers' Party will conduct its campaign with its own sources. However, Hitler did certainly make use, really for the first time in any major sort of way, of the radio. Radio, up until this point, had not been a major instrument in Weimar campaigning. But in this campaign for the March 5th elections, all of Hitler's major speeches were broadcast nationally, though there were several problems. A social democrat in Stuttgart cut the cable for all of southwest Germany at one point in the middle of one of Hitler's speeches, so that was frustrated. But nonetheless, the Nazis do begin to use the radio as a means of campaigning, and obviously not allowing access to the Social Democrats or the Communists. With the election just a week away, and with the National Socialist police very firmly in place, an event occurred which dramatically altered the course of events. In the middle of the night of February 27th to 28th, the Reichstag building in Berlin caught fire. It's an enormous structure, not at all configured like Capitol Hill out here, but of similar size, but a large block building. In the center of that building was the major meeting room of the Reichstag. And in the middle of the night, the building was absolutely consumed in flame. Police were sent directly to the building along with the fire departments to try to maintain control of the situation. They found in the building one man running around, clearly smelling of kerosene, and somebody who had obviously been involved in the blaze. That man was named Martinus van der Lubbe, a Dutchman, who, as it quickly turned out, had severe mental problems. Nobody else was caught in the Reichstag that evening. In the middle of that same night, with the building still very much in flames, at a meeting of top National Socialist leadership, the National Socialists drafted what came to be known as the Reichstag Fire Decree for the protection of people and state, to guard against communist acts of violence endangering the state, is the way the Nazis put it. The Reichstag Fire Decree, drawn up in the middle of that night, ended all basic civil rights guaranteed by the Weimar Constitution. Freedom of press, freedom of expression, freedom of association, secrecy of the mails and of the telephone, all now were subject to government control. It gave the government essentially the rights of martial law. It set aside the Weimar Constitution, and indeed the Reichstag Fire Decree would become the, quote, legal foundation of the Third Reich. It was this document which would provide the new regime with the legal framework to move against its enemies. The KPD, the German Communist Party, was singled out as the perpetrator of this act. The communists, of course, denied any sort of role in the burning of the Reichstag and instead blamed the Nazis. The communist position was, of course, the Nazis set the fire. We didn't. The Nazis did it, and the Reichstag Fire Decree is proof that they did it. However, and I think that view is one that has really been maintained over the course of decades until relatively recently, when an analysis of internal National Socialist documents has led historians to conclude that whoever else set the Reichstag on fire, it certainly was not the NSDAP. It was not the Nazis. Nor does it seem likely that it was the communists. Against all sorts of probability, it seems from the documents available to us now that the Reichstag was set on fire by Martinus van der Lubbe acting alone. It's again one of those cases in history where the improbable, in fact, turns out to be reality. But it's important. The Reichstag fire is important not simply for this sort of mystery which has been cleared up. The important thing is the conclusions that the Nazis themselves drew from the Reichstag fire, and that they moved quickly to take advantage of the situation as it presented itself. What's important about it from the point of view of understanding National Socialism, not so much for the Weimar period, but certainly understanding the Nazis in power, is if the Reichstag were burned by the Nazis as part of a general plan, and this is the way that I think we've traditionally approached National Socialism in the Third Reich, that the Nazis were operating with a kind of game plan, that the burning of the Reichstag was necessary to create the illusion of a communist revolution, of which that was to be the first shot, and then the Nazis would move to introduce and then implement the kind of emergency decree that would set aside the Weimar Constitution, the Reichstag Fire Decree, as part of a step-by-step, self-conscious plan of the Nazis to achieve full power in Germany in the shortest possible period of time. That view has been challenged, and we'll certainly see this in our discussions as we talk about the Third Reich, by a different school of thought, looking at the ways in which the Nazis actually did make policy, the way the Nazis did actually try to implement the policies that they did develop, that the Nazis relied on improvisation, that the Nazis, in many cases, did not so much, that they certainly didn't operate according to any sort of game plan. That the Nazis were masters at improvisation, of taking a situation as it presented itself and then drawing conclusions from it and moving then in a ruthless way. Certainly on March 2nd, 1933, Goering made his goal clear, or the conclusion he drew from the Reichstag fire decree clear. "It will be my chief objective," he stated publicly, I quote, "to expunge the pestilence of communism, and all along the line we're moving on to the attack. The communists didn't expect that 48 hours afterwards," referring to the Reichstag, burning of the Reichstag, "already 2,000 of their top swindlers would be sitting behind bars. I don't need the Reichstag fire to move against communism, and I'm not betraying any secret when I say that if it were left to Hitler and me, the perpetrators would already be swinging on the gallows," close quote. This from the top law enforcement officer in the state of Prussia. On the following day, in case anybody had misunderstood his intentions, in a directive he sent to police authorities, he instructed them to interpret the Reichstag fire decrees very broadly. The police were to move against the communists, quote, "but then also against those who work with the communists or who support or further, even indirectly, their criminal goals," close quote. In other words, it wasn't just the communists now who were going to be targets of Nazi suppression and Nazi terror. It was going to be anyone who could even roughly be associated with the communists. And that meant, of course, the Social Democrats in the most obvious sense, but anyone else. The police, i.e. the SA, was now being encouraged to define enemies of the state in as broad a way as they wished and to move. The legal foundation was now in place. The police was under Nazi control. The courts would have to follow their lead. In the days that followed these directives, communist officials were arrested by the thousand. It's estimated that within the next 2 weeks, about 10,000 communist functionaries in Prussia alone were arrested. And the Nazis were very careful about this. Although some leading communist officials were arrested, the real targets that the Nazis singled out for arrest were the mid-level cadres of the communist and social democratic parties. As the Nazis so cheerfully put it, we want to cut them off at the knee. Was to break the chain of command between the head, the party leadership, and the rank and file. And the way to do this was to arrest these mid-level functionaries. Within a very short period of time, the jails in Prussia and the other states of Germany began to fill. Indeed, there were so many people now being arrested, even before the March elections, that the SA, the deputized SA, had to find other places to put the people that were being taken into what the Nazis called protective custody. They used abandoned warehouses, abandoned factories, in some cases gymnasiums around the country, to use as special concentration centers for those who were arrested. They did not operate on any sort of directive from above. They simply established these concentration camps as a means of dealing with the overflow of political prisoners. The election campaign for the March 5th contest was anything but a free election. The Communist Party was unable to conduct the campaign. The Social Democrats found themselves handicapped at every turn by the Nazis, by coercion of party leaders, of manipulation, by threats, by arrests, and so on. And on March 5th, when the voters went to the polls. It was not at all uncommon in certain areas of Germany for people to be lined up outside the polling booths and to have the, quote, police say, well, this is a very long line, and I know you all have other things to do. So is there anyone here who plans not to vote for the government of national concentration? If you do, please step forward. In this situation, a great many people who were not inclined to vote for the government of national concentration found themselves not voting at all, or simply seeing their votes go to the Nazis and to the conservatives. Nonetheless, the election ended with the NSDAP still unable to achieve a majority. Despite the coercion, despite the manipulation, despite the threats, the NSDAP, in what was not a free election, received only 44% of the national vote. I would see this election not as the last election of the Weimar Republic. It is the first election of the Third Reich. The Social Democrats and Communists did quite well in a number of places. In fact, did extremely well in Berlin. One of the reasons that Hitler hated Berlin and liked to spend as little time as possible there after these elections. Still, the Conservative Party, with its 8% of the vote, and the Nazis with their 44%, now at last did have a majority. And in an emergency decree issued immediately after the campaign, the government now demanded that every elected body in Germany, from the smallest sort of town council in a rural village all the way up to the state legislature of Prussia, had to reflect the outcome of those March 5th elections. The German people had spoken, the Nazis argued, and they want to have 44% Nazis, 8% conservative. They want to have a government of national concentration. So in the Berlin City Council, which had a huge social democratic and communist makeup, they were purged, and 44% Nazi, 8% conservative went into place. Shortly after the elections, Hitler orchestrated a major event. His swearing in as Chancellor on March 25th, or March 21st, would take place, obviously it couldn't take place in the burned out Reichstag, but took place out in Potsdam, a town associated with the Hohenzollern monarchy, with the great Hohenzollern traditions of the Prussian military. And the day was made up as a great as a sign of deference to Prussian ideals. The opening of the Reichstag was to take place in the garrison church in Potsdam, literally in the shadow of the tomb of Frederick the Great. There's a very famous photograph of Hitler and Hindenburg. The two still didn't like one another. Hindenburg came to the swearing in. The entire general staff of the German army was invited to the swearing in, something that had not happened before. Hindenburg appeared for the swearing-in ceremony wearing his dress uniform from the First World War with medals from here to here, and wearing his Pickelhaube, that funny pointed helmet that the Germans wore at the beginning of the war. Hitler in his top hat and tails arrived for the ceremony, and in a very, very famous photograph. In Germany, if you want to show deference to someone, when you shake hands, you bow. There's a very famous photograph of Hindenburg standing erect and looking monumental, as only Hindenburg could, shaking hands with Hitler, who is clearly almost bowing from the waist to the great field marshal. The whole purpose was to reassure conservatives that the National Socialist Revolution, about which so many people were now talking, was really consistent with the ideals of old conservative Prussia, the army, the Hohenzollerns, and so on. But the real purpose of the Reichstag gathering in Potsdam that day was for Hitler to announce a new law, which he wanted to have introduced into the Reichstag, a law which would revolutionize the legal foundations of government in Germany. He wanted to pass an enabling law. The Ermächtigungsgesetz is the German term. This would be introduced 2 days hence. It would give the government emergency decree power for a period of for several years. That it would not be necessary to go through the cumbersome process of asking the Reich president for emergency decree, but in effect the Reichstag would abdicate its responsibility, and that the government would be able to enact legislation without support from the Reichstag or from the Reich president. In order to do this, Hitler needed a two-thirds majority in the Reichstag, since it was an alteration of the Constitution. At this point, the Communist Party was banned, so its deputies vanished. And the question now was what would happen on the great climactic day of March 23rd, when the Reichstag was convened to vote. The KPD was banned. The Social Democrats were paralyzed. The liberals and conservatives, the liberals certainly in disarray, the conservatives inclined to vote for this enabling law anyway. The Catholic Center Party's position was pivotal here. If the Catholic Center Party and the Social Democrats voted against the enabling law, it would fail. Throughout February and into March, the Nazis had bent over backwards to appeal to the Catholic Church, to make clear that the regime intended to sign a concordat with the Vatican, that the new regime was an enemy of Marxism, would preserve the Church, and was not the sort of dangerous, radical, anti-religious force that so many had feared. To allay the fears of the Catholic population and of the Church authorities. And on that day, with the SS, another elite organization of the NSDAP that we'll talk about a great deal tomorrow, and the SA ringing the Reichstag meeting. On the 23rd of March, the Catholic Center Party supported the passage of the enabling law. Only the German Social Democratic Party refused. I do not know of any actual film footage of that incredible meeting. But there is an audio, a recording of the speech, certainly of Hitler's speech demanding the passage of the law. And then an incredible speech made by Otto Wels, the Social Democratic spokesman, with the catcalls and jeering of the Nazis in the background, knowing full well that the SA was surrounding the building, with the strains of the Horst Wessel song in the background. Wels got up before the Reichstag on that day and said, if we allow this law to pass, we are saying goodbye to everything that we understand by civilization and decency in Germany. The Social Democrats voted against the enabling law on that day, but their votes alone were not enough. Wels was arrested, many of the Social Democratic leaders arrested on the steps of the Reichstag. The enabling law passed, and the legal foundations for the Third Reich were now in place. Following the passage of the enabling law, the Nazis moved against what was left of the other political parties. The media was now brought under control completely. The police was firmly in the hands of the Nazis. The courts now had a legal foundation on which to proceed. On May Day, 1933, the Nazis declared this a national day of German labor. It would be the first German government to make it a national holiday. There were great demonstrations, pro-labor demonstrations by the Nazis during that day in Berlin. And on that evening, the Nazis moved in and seized labor union halls all over Germany. The labor union collapsed. The labor movement in Germany collapsed. Its leaders thrown into the burgeoning system of concentration camps and into prison. The church, the Catholic Church in particular, now brought on board through the agreement with the evolving agreement with the Vatican. By the summer of 1933, all of the major political parties of Germany had either been banned or had voluntarily disbanded. On July 14th, the Nazis had a considerable sense of irony. On Bastille Day, 1933, the Nazis introduced a law that made the existence of any political party other than the National Socialist German Workers' Party illegal. Within an extraordinarily short period of time, the NSDAP had managed not only to come to power, but had transformed the battered Weimar Republic into what was on its way to being a totalitarian regime. The police, the courts, the media, all now were firmly in the hands of the National Socialists. The Nazis had proceeded according to what they referred to as salami tactics. No one great enormous step that was likely to cause opposition, but small, tiny slices of the salami, cut away, until one suddenly looked up and the whole thing was gone. Each step the Nazis took was scrupulously legal in the narrowest sense of the term. But of course, all of that pseudo-legality was an assault on the very basis of decency, democracy, decency and democracy that the Weimar Republic had stood for.